Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about spending the equivalent of billions of dollars on a weapon of apocalyptic power.
Right, a machine so colossal, so resource-intensive, that it dictates the entire economic posture of your empire.
Yeah, but the catch is you build it with the explicit hope that you will never, ever actually have to fire it.
You're just building it to sit there.
Precisely. Today, we are looking at a stack of historical naval records, primary accounts, tactical analyses, design blueprints, and decrypted intelligence intercepts from World War I. Our objective is to unpack the greatest maritime arms race in human history.
We're looking at a primary dynamic that really dictated the course of the 20th century. So you have this entrenched British blockade slowly starving the Central Powers, and then Germany's desperate, highly innovative attempts to break that blockade.
To understand this, you really have to set the scene at the turn of the 20th century. Great Britain rules the waves. They have an empire utterly dependent on sea lanes.
But a rapidly industrializing Germany, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, is looking to challenge that dominance. And that challenge, it didn't begin with laying down steel in a shipyard. It began with an intellectual framework.
Right, a book.
Yeah, in 1890, an American naval officer and historian named Alfred Thayer Mahan published a book titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History.
I mean, looking at the historical records, this text was read globally. It changed everything.
It really did. He analyzed historical conflicts, looking deeply at the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, and he argued a very specific thesis. Mahan pointed out that Rome, a land power, could only defeat Carthage, a sea power, by building its own navy and taking control of the Mediterranean.
So his conclusion was absolute.
Yes, global preeminence required naval supremacy. A nation could only thrive, secure its trade, and impose its will on others if it controlled the world's sea lanes.
And the proper way to achieve that control, according to Mahan, was not through, just harassing merchant ships.
Right, no, it was through large-scale decisive battles between heavily armed, concentrated fleets.
In the United States, Congress immediately ordered the building of new battleships after reading this. Japan used these principles, the devastating effect against Russia at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905.
But the text found its most fervent audience in Germany.
Kaiser Wilhelm II read the book in 1894, right?
He did, and he actually ordered copies placed on every single ship in the German Navy. He had this deep-seated desire to match the British Royal Navy.
Which was a force he had observed closely during visits to his grandmother, Queen Victoria.
Yeah, and he found the perfect architect for this ambition in Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. Tirpitz was recalled from his duties in the Far East in 1897 to become the Secretary of State of the German Imperial Naval Office.
And Tirpitz was an absolute disciple of Mahan's theories.
Oh, completely. He went to the Reichstag, the German parliament, and pushed through a series of fleet acts starting in 1898. He implemented a strategy known as risk theory.
Creating what naval theorists call a fleet in being.
Right. And the underlying logic here is crucial to understand. Tirpitz knew that Germany, with its shorter coastline and land-based enemies, could not outbuild Great Britain ship for ship.
So what was the point of building the fleet?
Well, the German Imperial Navy did not necessarily need to completely defeat the Royal Navy in a decisive battle to achieve its geopolitical aims.
Okay, let us unpack this, because the logic feels a bit counterintuitive. It is like a corporate arms race.
How do you mean?
Germany did not need to buy out the leading company. They just needed a legal team so intimidating that the leading company would not dare sue them.
That is a brilliant way to look at it.
They needed a fleet strong enough that if Britain ever attacked it, the resulting damage to the Royal Navy would be so severe that Britain would be left vulnerable to its other global rivals, like France and Russia.
Right. By presenting an unacceptable level of risk, Germany hoped to force Britain to make diplomatic concessions.
But how did Britain react to this sudden aggressive posturing? Because if someone starts building an intimidation force in your backyard, you do not just sit there.
You certainly do not, especially if your survival depends on the sea. For a long time, Britain adhered to the two-power standard.
That was a mathematical policy, wasn't it?
Yeah, it ensured the Royal Navy was at least the size of the next two largest navies in the world combined. Britain's economy was entirely dependent on maritime logistics.
I mean, by the year 1900, 58% of the calories consumed by the British population came from overseas.
Free movement on the seas was not a point of national pride. It was a matter of basic caloric survival. A blockade meant severe food shortages within weeks.
So when Germany began passing those fleet acts, the British Admiralty initially observed the buildup with caution.
But as the sheer scale of Tirpitz's ambition materialized into steel, that caution turned to profound anxiety.
And that anxiety boiled over into outright public panic. By 1908, the British public and political opposition were demanding that the government meet the German challenge head-on.
There was a genuine fear of invasion.
This led to a famous rallying cry in the streets: "We want 8 and we won't wait." They were demanding the immediate funding and construction of 8 brand-new battleships.
And that public pressure resulted in a severe escalation. In April 1910, the funding for those 8 ships was passed.
What we see here is an intellectual arms race rapidly materializing into vast quantities of steel.
Yeah, and this output was driven by a recent technological leap that had rendered every older fleet on the planet obsolete overnight.
Okay, but if Britain was so panicked about the German buildup, why did the head of the Royal Navy, First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher, decide to build a ship that effectively wiped out Britain's own numerical advantage?
It seems contradictory, right?
It really does. How does that logic work? We need to look at the anatomy of this technological marvel, HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, to understand why it changed everything.
First, it utilized an all-big gun layout.
Prior to this, battleships had a mix of different gun sizes, right?
Yeah, say 4 12-inch guns, a few 8-inch guns, and some 6-inch guns.
What was the problem with that?
The problem was ballistic physics and visual identification. When a pre-dreadnought fired all its guns at an enemy ship thousands of yards away, it created multiple splashes of water of varying sizes.
So the gunnery officers looking through their optics.
They could not tell which splash belonged to the 12-inch gun and which belonged to the 8-inch gun.
Wait, really? It was just a wall of water?
Basically, yes. And without knowing that, they could not calculate the necessary corrections to hit the target.
So Dreadnought eliminated this confusion.
Entirely. It featured 10 12-inch guns housed in 5 turrets. By standardizing the main armament, Fisher allowed for centralized electrical fire control systems.
Meaning one guy could control the whole thing?
Right. The gunnery officer could sit high up in the spotting top, observe the fall of a single unified salvo of heavy shells, and adjust the range for the entire ship simultaneously.
This pushed the effective combat range from a couple of thousand yards out to 10,000 yards.
Which is an enormous leap. And it was not just the guns. Dreadnought was the first major warship powered by steam turbine engines, rather than the older triple expansion steam engines.
Break down for me why turbines are so vastly superior, because this seems like the engineering detail that really separated the Dreadnoughts from everything that came before.
Okay, so a triple expansion engine relies on heavy pistons going up and down, much like a car engine. This motion is violent. It shakes the ship, it is incredibly loud, and it wastes energy because the piston has to constantly change direction.
And a steam turbine.
It works more like a windmill. High-pressure steam is forced continuously through a series of bladed rotors, spinning them in a single direction.
So it is smoother.
Smoother, far more reliable, and crucially, much faster. Turbines allowed Dreadnought to maintain a speed of 21 knots.
Meaning she could outrun any older battleship in existence.
Right. And in naval warfare, the faster ship dictates the terms of engagement. You can choose when to fight and when to retreat.
The power generated by those engines also ran intricate electrical systems throughout the ship. I mean, picture the interior of these vessels.
This has been terrifying.
Down in the magazines, 6 stories below the top of the turrets, sailors were handling shells that weighed 1,500 pounds.
1,500 pounds. Just let that sink in.
And these shells were hoisted up into the turrets using electric elevators, followed by heavy bags of powder.
The men working in these lower compartments were surrounded by high-voltage electrical distribution boards that powered the hoists, the ventilation fans, and the lighting.
It was a harsh, intensely hot environment. These complex systems represented the absolute cutting edge of early 20th century engineering.
Absolutely. And as other nations rushed to build their own dreadnoughts, distinct design philosophies emerged.
The British prioritized speed and heavy firepower.
They did. They consistently equipped their ships with larger calibers, moving from 12-inch to 13.5-inch, and eventually 15-inch guns.
And to maximize speed, they developed a subclass of warship called the battlecruiser.
Right. A battlecruiser possessed the heavy guns of a dreadnought, but sacrificed thick armor plating to achieve greater speeds.
Operating on the theory that it could outrun what it could not outgun.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the Germans took a different approach. When you look at German design schematics, like the König-class battleships, you see a prioritization of survivability.
So they accepted slightly smaller main guns.
Yeah, usually 11 or 12 inches, in exchange for heavy armor plating, a double-bottom hull to protect against mines, and intricate watertight compartmentalization.
They also built their secondary weapons into casemates. What exactly is a casemate, and how does it play into this design?
A casemate is essentially an armored room built directly into the side of the ship's hull to house the secondary, smaller guns.
Okay, so it is highly fortified.
Very much so. Whereas British designs often left secondary batteries more exposed. The German philosophy was that a ship must first survive the enemy's fire in order to return it.
If a German ship took a hit, its intricate compartmentalization meant it was far less likely to flood entirely.
Right. They also possessed superior optical range-finding equipment. The lenses crafted by German optics firms allowed their gunners to calculate range and bearing with incredible precision.
Making their initial salvos highly accurate. But wait, I need to push back on Fisher's strategy here.
Go ahead.
You have a numerical advantage that guarantees the safety of your empire, and you willingly throw it away for a single advanced prototype.
It sounds reckless.
It really does. Fisher wiped out Britain's historical advantage of older ships and allowed Germany to start the arms race from scratch on an equal footing. That sounds like a terrible gamble.
It was undeniably a severe risk, but the reality of technological momentum is unforgiving.
You mean someone else would have done it?
Exactly. If Britain had not built the all-big-gun battleship, the intelligence indicated that another nation, likely the United States or Japan, would have done so shortly thereafter.
So Fisher chose to ensure Britain was the first to possess the weapon of the future.
Rather than clinging to the weapons of the past, yes. However, your point about risk highlights a critical flaw in the British approach that would later prove deadly.
In their pursuit of overwhelming offensive power, the British prioritized a rapid rate of fire over magazine safety.
Right, and this comes down to the chemistry and handling of the explosives.
Break down for me why the British propellant and explosives were so much more dangerous than what the Germans were using.
It comes down to two substances, cordite and lyddite. Cordite was the British propellant, packed into silk bags and loaded behind the shell to fire it out of the barrel.
And cordite is highly volatile.
Very. If exposed to a spark or flash, it does not just slowly burn. It rapidly combusts, creating a flash fire of thousands of degrees that travels instantly.
And the British gun crews, wanting to fire as fast as possible, routinely left the protective flash-tight doors open between the turret and the magazine below to speed up the hoists.
Which is just a recipe for disaster. Furthermore, the British used lyddite, a form of picric acid, in their armor-piercing shells.
Lyddite was notoriously unstable, right?
Highly prone to detonating prematurely upon impact with heavy armor, rather than penetrating and exploding inside the enemy ship.
So this combination of unstable chemicals and poor safety protocols meant that a single enemy shell penetrating a British turret had a high probability of sparking a catastrophic chain reaction straight down into the ship's magazines.
A literal powder keg. Now, while these steel leviathans were being built for a decisive clash in the North Sea, the outbreak of the war in 1914 ignited conflicts across the entire globe.
The naval war was not confined to European waters.
Not at all. Germany had ships stationed overseas to protect its colonial interests, and these vessels immediately began raiding Allied commerce.
In the Pacific, you had the German East Asia Squadron under Admiral Graf Maximilian von Spee.
And in the Indian Ocean, the light cruiser SMS Emden conducted a highly successful raiding campaign.
They captured or sank 30 Allied merchant ships before finally being hunted down.
Right. We also see the profound strategic impact of isolated advanced vessels. Consider the Mediterranean.
Ah, the Goeben.
Yes, the German battlecruiser SMS Goeben and the light cruiser SMS Breslau managed to evade British pursuit and reach Constantinople.
Their arrival and subsequent transfer to the Ottoman Navy played a significant role in bringing the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of the Central Powers.
The Goeben then operated in the Black Sea, completely altering the balance of power there against the Russian fleet.
The story of the Goeben in the Black Sea is a perfect illustration of how much a single advanced ship could change the board.
I'll say.
The Russian Black Sea fleet was large, but mostly consisted of slower, older pre-dreadnoughts.
Right, and the Goeben was a modern battlecruiser.
So it played this relentless game of cat and mouse. Because the Goeben could easily use its turbine engines to outrun the Russian fleet, isolate a single older Russian ship and obliterate it from 10,000 yards away, the entire Russian fleet was forced to operate together as a single unit out of fear.
One ship tied down an entire navy.
Exactly. The core strategic reality defining the war at sea, however, was the British blockade.
Yeah, the British Grand Fleet, operating out of bases like Scapa Flow in Scotland, effectively sealed off the North Sea.
This cut Germany off from the global trade networks they relied upon, leading to severe shortages of raw materials and food.
And the German High Seas Fleet, outnumbered by the British dreadnoughts, generally remained in port behind extensive minefields.
To retaliate against this slow strangulation, Germany turned to a relatively untested weapon, the submarine or U-boat.
The U-boats are like a fighter in an asymmetric martial arts bout.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. Instead of trading punches with a heavier opponent, the fighter targets the opponent's circulatory system.
The submarines bypassed the heavy armor of the dreadnoughts entirely to strike at the vulnerable merchant ships carrying food and supplies.
Attempting to starve the British island, just as the British were starving Germany. Initially, submarines operated under cruiser rules.
What did that entail under international law?
Under cruiser rules, a submarine had to surface, fire a warning shot across the bow of the merchant ship, allow the civilian crew to evacuate into lifeboats, and only then sink the vessel.
But operating under cruiser rules was highly dangerous for a submarine, right?
Extremely. A submarine's primary defense is stealth. On the surface, its hull is thin and highly vulnerable to even small-caliber gunfire.
And as the British began arming their merchant vessels and utilizing Q-ships, heavily armed warships, disguised as helpless merchant surfacing, became suicidal for U-boat crews.
Consequently, Germany initiated campaigns of unrestricted submarine warfare, authorizing U-boats to sink merchant and passenger ships without warning while submerged.
This tactic was effective at sinking tonnage, but the geopolitical fallout was immense.
Sinking civilian ships without warning caused international outrage.
The most famous incident was the sinking of the ocean liner RMS Lusitania in 1915, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 civilians, including many Americans.
Looking at the diplomatic records, this was a disaster for Germany.
They argued the ship was carrying munitions, which it was, and that they had published warnings, but sinking it alienated neutral nations.
The political pressure from the United States was so intense that Germany temporarily halted unrestricted submarine warfare,
Proving that technological tactics operate within a fragile diplomatic ecosystem.
Absolutely. Now, despite the global commerce rating and the underwater strangulation by the U-boats, the commanders on both sides knew the ultimate fate of the war at sea hinged on the dreadnought fleet staring each other down across the North Sea.
By early 1916, the setup was a tense stalemate. You have the British Grand Fleet under Admiral John Jellicoe and the German High Seas Fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer.
Scheer knew he could not win a direct fleet-on-fleet battle due to British numerical superiority.
So his strategy was to lure out small portions of the British fleet with coastal raids on English towns.
And destroy those isolated squadrons piecemeal with his full force before the rest of the British fleet could arrive.
To counter these sorties, the British Admiralty relied heavily on a secret intelligence division known as Room 40.
Room 40 possessed a profound strategic advantage. They had the primary German naval code books.
How did they get their hands on the most guarded secret in the German Imperial Navy?
Well, in 1914, the German light cruiser SMS Magdeburg ran aground in the Baltic Sea in heavy fog.
And the Russian forces were approaching.
Right, which compelled the German crew to throw their codebooks overboard to prevent capture. However, they threw them into shallow water.
Russian divers were sent down into the freezing Baltic and managed to recover the physical signal book Der Kaiserlichen Marine from the seabed.
This codebook was passed to their British allies, enabling Room 40 to decrypt German wireless communications.
Because the German fleet transmitted their positions nightly, the British could track their movements.
But having the codes is only half the battle. Interpreting the intelligence is where human error comes in.
And that leads to a catastrophic communication error on May 30th, 1916.
A massive blunder.
The British had intercepted orders indicating the German fleet was preparing for a major operation. The director of the Operations Division, Captain Thomas Jackson, went into Room 40 and asked precisely where the German call sign DK was located.
Room 40 informed him that DK was transmitting from the port of Wilhelmshaven.
Jackson left the room, assuming the main German fleet had not sailed yet.
What Captain Jackson failed to realize, or perhaps arrogantly overlooked, was a standard German security protocol.
What protocol was that?
When Admiral Scheer took the fleet to sea, he assumed a different call sign and transferred the DK call sign to a shore station to mask his departure.
And Room 40 personnel were fully aware of this practice.
They were, but Jackson did not ask, "Where is Admiral Scheer?" He specifically asked about the call sign.
Because of strict departmental silos and a culture that discouraged analysts from speaking out of turn to senior officers, they answered his specific question without volunteering the context.
Right. So Jackson passed the flawed conclusion up the chain of command.
Wait, let me get this straight. The British had the ultimate intelligence advantage. They knew the German codes, they knew the security protocols, and they compromised it because a captain failed to ask a follow-up question, and the analysts were too intimidated to correct him.
That is precisely what occurred.
Oh, seriously, that is infuriating.
It really is. This intelligence failure, combined with Admiral Jellicoe's growing distrust of Room 40 due to previously delayed or misinterpreted messages, created a profound fog of confusion.
When Jellicoe sailed out from Scapa Flow to meet what he thought would be a small raiding force, he was completely unaware that the entire German high seas fleet was already at sea heading his way.
It set the stage for two colossal fleets comprising 250 ships and over 100,000 men to blindly stumble into one another.
So the two fleets are sailing toward each other, completely unaware of the true scale of what is about to happen.
This blind stumble resulted in the Battle of Jutland, the largest, most complex naval engagement of the war, kicking off on the afternoon of May 31st, 1916.
Vice Admiral David Beatty, commanding the fast British battlecruiser fleet, is scouting ahead of Jellicoe's main force.
Simultaneously, Vice Admiral Franz Hipper is leading the German scouting group ahead of Scheer.
At 2:10 in the afternoon, a British light cruiser spots a Danish steamer blowing off steam and moves to investigate.
Two German cruisers are doing the exact same thing. They spot each other, and at 3:48 in the afternoon, the heavy guns open fire.
This initiates the phase of the battle known as the run to the south.
Right. Hipper immediately turns his battlecruiser southeast, attempting to lure Beatty's force directly into the path of Scheer's advancing high seas fleet.
Beatty takes the bait and gives chase. The two lines of battlecruisers begin exchanging heavy salvos at ranges exceeding 15,000 yards.
The physical environment deeply favored the Germans during this phase.
Why is that?
The sun was setting in the west, which silhouetted the British ships against a bright sky, making them incredibly clear targets for the German optical rangefinders.
Conversely, the German vessels were obscured by the gray eastern sky.
Furthermore, the westward wind blew the thick black coal smoke from the British funnels forward, obscuring their own vision.
And here is where the horrific consequences of British design choices become apparent.
At 4:02 in the afternoon, the German battlecruiser Von der Tann lands several hits on the British battlecruiser Indefatigable.
The shells penetrate the comparatively thin upper armor and detonate.
Because the British gun crews had bypassed safety protocols to increase their rate of fire, leaving the flash-tight doors open, the explosion in the turret sends a huge flash of fire straight down the hoist and into the magazine.
The cordite ignites. The Indefatigable is ripped apart by a colossal internal explosion.
She sinks rapidly, taking over 1,000 men down with her. Only 2 survive.
Only 2.
Only 2. The structural vulnerability of the British battlecruisers was exposed with devastating swiftness.
Just 20 minutes later, at 4:25, a combined salvo from the sidelets and the Derfflinger strikes the Queen Mary.
The shells detonate over her forward turret. A catastrophic explosion breaks the ship in half, and she sinks instantly with the loss of 1,270 men.
Any turret penetration was a potential death sentence for the entire vessel.
There is a vivid story from Beatty's own flagship, the Lion, that perfectly illustrates the razor's edge these ships were operating on.
What happened on the Lion?
A German shell strikes the Lion's Q turret, blows off the roof plate, and kills or wounds everyone inside. A severe cordite fire breaks out, threatening to travel straight down the open hoist into the magazine.
The turret commander, Major Francis Harvey, is fatally wounded, having lost both his legs.
With his dying breath, he orders the magazine doors closed and the compartment flooded.
His immediate action prevents the Lion from suffering the same fate as the Indefatigable and Queen Mary.
It is shortly after this, watching 2 of his capital ships vaporize, that Beatty turns to his flag captain and makes his famous, understated remark.
There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today.
Such a chillingly calm response to absolute disaster.
Despite the grievous losses, Beatty continues the pursuit. But he has a major card to play that he is not using.
Attached to Beatty's command was the 5th Battle Squadron under Hugh Evan Thomas.
This squadron consisted of 4 fast battleships armed with heavy 15-inch guns. These ships could have crushed Hipper's battlecruisers.
Why did the 5th Battle Squadron end up 10 miles behind Beatty during this crucial phase?
The failure came down to rigid signaling protocols and the environmental conditions of early 20th century naval combat.
Right, the British relied heavily on visual flag signals run up on halyards rather than wireless telegraphy, out of fear that wireless signals could be intercepted or jammed.
When Beatty ordered a sudden turn to the southeast to engage Hipper, the signal flags on his flagship were completely obscured by the dense clouds of coal smoke pouring from the funnels.
So they literally could not see the command to turn.
Correct. The commanders of the 5th Battle Squadron could not read the flags.
Because they were trained in a rigid doctrine to obey orders precisely and wait for explicit confirmation rather than acting on initiative, they maintained their original course for several crucial minutes.
By the time they finally made the turn, they were miles behind the main action, unable to bring their heavy guns to bear when Beatty needed them most.
This wastes the British firepower advantage. And just as Beatty's vanguard is taking this terrible punishment, the leading light cruisers spot something horrifying on the horizon.
The distinct outlines of the entire German high seas fleet advancing north.
Beatty realizes he has been lured into a trap.
He executes a desperate U-turn, heading back north. Now the dynamic flips.
Beatty is trying to lead Hipper and Scheer directly into the path of Admiral Jellicoe's Grand Fleet, which is speeding south to meet them.
This begins the phase known as the run to the north.
Beatty's surviving battlecruisers, now supported by the trailing fire of the 5th Battle Squadron, engage in a running gun battle with the advancing German forces.
The 5th Battle Squadron takes severe punishment from the concentrated fire of the German dreadnoughts, absorbing dozens of heavy shell hits, but their thick armor holds, allowing them to cover the retreat.
At roughly 6 o'clock in the evening, Jellicoe's Grand Fleet arrives on the scene.
But Jellicoe is operating in a profound fog of war. He has received conflicting, delayed reports about the enemy's exact position.
As the distinct forms of the German ships emerge from the mist and smoke, Jellicoe has to make a critical tactical decision in a matter of minutes.
He orders a highly complex maneuver at a point that becomes known as Windy Corner.
He deploys his 24 dreadnoughts from their parallel cruising columns into a single, continuous battle line heading east.
By deploying to the east, Jellicoe executes the ultimate naval tactical maneuver. He crosses the T.
To understand the geometry of this, picture a capital letter. P. Jellicoe's line of battleships forms the horizontal bar at the top, while Scheer's advancing fleet forms the vertical line pushing up from the bottom.
The supreme advantage of this position is ballistic. Every single British ship in the horizontal line can turn its turrets sideways and fire a full broadside, bringing all their main guns to bear on the target.
However, the German ships, stuck in a single-file vertical column, block each other's line of sight. Only the forward-facing guns of the very leading German ship can return fire.
As the fog parts, Admiral Scheer realizes with horror that he has sailed directly into a trap.
The entire horizon is filled with the flashing guns of the British Grand Fleet.
The leading German dreadnoughts start taking heavy hits. Scheer knows his fleet will be annihilated if they maintain their current course.
To escape the trap, he orders a maneuver called the Gefechtskartwendung, which translates to an action turn together.
Break down the mechanics of this because it is not just turning the steering wheel.
It is an incredibly difficult feat of seamanship. Instead of the lead ship turning and the ships behind it following in its wake like a snake, every single ship in the German line has to reverse its course simultaneously by turning 180 degrees at the exact same moment.
If one ship turns a few seconds late or misjudges its speed, it will collide with the ship next to it.
Executing this maneuver under heavy fire, amidst thick smoke, without radio communication, requires immense discipline.
The German fleet executes the turn flawlessly and vanishes into the mist.
Jellicoe, wary of submarine and torpedo ambushes in the wake of a retreating enemy, chooses not to pursue directly, but rather alters course to place his fleet between Scheer and his home ports.
Scheer, attempting to slip behind the British line in the confusion, blunders into Jellicoe's center once again a short time later.
Again, Jellicoe crosses his T, and again the German fleet is subjected to a terrifying bombardment.
To buy time for a second escape, Scheer issues a desperate order to his heavily damaged battlecruisers. Charge the British line directly.
This becomes known as the death ride of the battlecruisers. Ships like the Derflinger and the Seelitz endure horrific punishment to cover the retreat of the main fleet.
The Derflinger takes 14 heavy hits, losing multiple turrets, her chart house blown away, fires raging below decks.
The Seelitz is battered relentlessly, taking hits that shatter her casemates and flood her forward compartments until she is practically sinking by the bow.
They absorb an immense volume of fire, but their sacrifice allows the rest of the German dreadnoughts to turn away under the cover of a vast smoke screen laid by torpedo boats.
As dusk falls, the battle transitions into a night action. Jellicoe organizes his fleet into a tight cruising formation, determined to wait until dawn to resume the battle, believing he has Scheer cut off from his bases.
But the night action is like a chaotic brawl in a pitch-black room. You have these enormous machines blindly flashing recognition lights at each other in the dark.
And here, the British possessed severe deficiencies.
How so?
Well, the Imperial German Navy had trained extensively for night engagements. They utilized centralized, localized searchlight control systems.
Meaning they could see without blinding themselves.
Right. They could turn on a narrow beam to eliminate a target without blinding their own gunners, and they employed colored recognition signals.
The British, conversely, lacked this training. When they turned on their large searchlights, they illuminated their own ships and blinded their optical operators.
Furthermore, earlier in the evening, a British ship breached security by broadcasting the challenge code openly.
German ships memorized it, allowing them to flash partially correct codes, causing fatal hesitation among the British gunners.
That hesitation led to absolute carnage. In the confusion of the dark, isolated British ships stumbled into the German line.
The armored cruiser HMS Black Prince became separated and mistakenly approached the German dreadnoughts, thinking they were British.
Illuminated suddenly by searchlights at point-blank range, she was obliterated by overwhelming gunfire and blew up with the loss of her entire crew.
The British destroyer flotillas fought desperate, close-quarters actions, launching torpedoes and taking heavy losses against the German secondary batteries.
Despite the fierce fighting at the rear of his formation, Scheer manages to smash his way through the British light forces.
Jellicoe, positioned further ahead, hears the gunfire but remains cautious, fearing night torpedo attacks.
Furthermore, the Admiralty in London receives intercepted intelligence from Room 40, showing Scheer's exact escape route through the Horn's Reef, but they fail to pass this critical information along to Jellicoe.
Consequently, Scheer slips behind the British fleet and navigates through the minefields back to safety.
As dawn breaks on June 1st, the sea is empty. The battle is over, leaving both nations to tally the wreckage and claim the victory.
Let us look at the raw statistics of the battle, because they offer a grim accounting. The British lost 14 ships and suffered over 6,000 men killed.
The Germans lost 11 ships and 2,500 men.
Based purely on tonnage sunk and casualties inflicted, the German press immediately celebrated Jutland as a great tactical victory, claiming to have broken the myth of Trafalgar and shattered British naval invincibility.
And looking at those numbers, it is hard to argue with them.
I mean, how can you possibly sell the loss of 6,000 men and 14 ships to the British public as a win?
Tactically, the Germans inflicted more damage, there's no denying that. But when you look past the headlines, the strategic reality tells a completely different story.
Despite absorbing heavier losses, the British Grand Fleet was replenished, reorganized, and reported ready for action the very next day.
They maintained their blockade position. They still controlled the North Sea.
The German High Seas Fleet, however, was severely battered. Many of their surviving ships, like the Seelitz, barely made it back to port, taking on thousands of tons of water and required months of extensive repairs.
The German Naval Command realized definitively that they could never win a war of attrition against the sheer size of the Royal Navy.
Following Jutland, the German surface fleet remained largely confined to port for the remainder of the war. They never again attempted a full-scale fleet engagement.
Instead, Scheer shifted Germany's naval strategy entirely back to the U-boat commerce raiding campaign.
Concluding that unrestricted submarine warfare was the only viable method to pressure the British economy.
The dreadnoughts, built at such staggering expense, essentially became floating coastal defense batteries.
The story of these ships concludes with a somber vignette. Following the armistice in 1918, the German High Seas Fleet was interned by the Allies at Skepaflo in Scotland, pending the outcome of the Versailles Peace Treaty negotiations.
On June 21, 1919, the German commander, Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, acting under the belief that the peace talks had failed and the ships would be permanently seized and divided among the victorious Allies, issued a secret order.
Utilizing prearranged signals, the skeleton crews opened the Seacoxon valves below decks, scuttling their own fleet.
In a matter of hours, 400,000 tons of the finest German steel slipped beneath the Scottish waters, an act of defiance that prevented the ships from falling into enemy hands.
You have to wonder, did the dreadnoughts actually change the course of the war, or did they just cancel each other out?
It is a profound question.
They built these enormous weapons, fought one confusing battle that essentially ended in a draw, and then spent the rest of the war sitting in port.
While Jutland was a tactical draw, it is vital to understand that the dreadnoughts served their ultimate strategic purpose for the British.
Because they maintained the blockade?
Exactly. The sheer existence of the Grand Fleet and its ability to absorb the losses at Jutland and remain on station meant that the British blockade held firm.
That blockade cut German imports by 55%. It led to critical shortages of food, starving the civilian population.
It cut off imports of nitrates, meaning Germany had to choose between manufacturing explosives for the front lines or fertilizer for their crops.
The blockade slowly but surely strangled the German war effort.
It proves that sea power is ultimately about controlling logistics and global supply chains, not merely about sinking enemy warships.
The dreadnoughts guaranteed the blockade, and the blockade was a decisive factor in the defeat of the Central Powers.
Which leads to a final thought for you to consider.
The lessons of Jutland, the vulnerability of heavily armored giants to internal explosions, the devastating impact of mines, and the lethal effectiveness of cheaper asymmetric weapons like torpedoes and submarines, they all foreshadowed the end of the battleship era entirely.
The very arms race that defined the start of the century built weapons that, by the time the next major global war erupted a few decades later, would be rendered entirely obsolete by the advent of naval aviation and strikes from the sky.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.